grand jury.
All present.
All right, the party next, please.
Thank you, Your Honor. State call Tracy Thrower.
Do you swear affirm the testimony you shall give the court and the jury in the trial in this case to be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Please state your first and last name and spell your last name loudly and clearly for the record.
Tracy Thrower, Thrower.
Morning, sir.
Good morning.
Could you tell the jury where you work?
I'm employed by the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division in the Forensic Services Building in the Firearms Department.
And what's your occupation and position?
I am the supervisor of the Firearms Department, and I am also a firearm and tool mark examiner.
And do you have a rank at SLED?
Yes, sir. I'm a lieutenant. I'm also a senior special agent.
And how long have you been with SLED?
Approximately 17 years.
And you indicated that you were a supervisor in charge of the firearms department. Can you explain to the jury what that means and what your job entailed?
As supervisor, I monitor department activities. I help or write the protocols that we follow in performing examinations, quality assurance. I also perform firearm and tool mark examination casework.
And of your almost 18 years with SLED, how long have you been in firearms identification?
The entire time.
And what does the actual field of firearms identification constitute?
Firearms identification is a division of forensic science in which an examiner looks at fired ammunition components such as bullets and cartridge cases, and we try to determine if those bullets and cartridge cases were fired by a specific firearm. This is performed through the evaluation of class, subclass, and individual characteristics.
And what's your educational background?
My educational background, I've got a Bachelor of Science degree from Winthrop University with a major in biology. I've completed the South Carolina Criminal Justice Academy. I also completed the SLED course of instruction on firearm and tool mark examination. This course of instruction was approximately a 3-year mentorship style training program that was supervised by court-qualified firearm examiners. During this course of instruction, I had to perform extensive reading, extensive studying. I had to assist examiners in preparing of cases. I had the opportunity to attend various schools, seminars, and conferences. I had to perform extensive microscopic comparisons. Upon completing my course of training, I took a final competency exam where I was deemed competent and allowed to begin working cases on my own. Since then, I have furthered my education. I attend conferences for the Association of Firearm and Tool Mark Examiners. I continue to read and study periodicals, reference materials in the field of firearms identification. I've completed the Federal Bureau of Investigations course on specialized techniques in firearm identification. I've completed the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms course on serial number restoration. I've completed a course on scientifically defensible criteria for the identification of tool marks, which is taught by Bruce Murdoch and Paul Moran. To name a few, I have completed numerous courses or armorer courses where they concentrate on specific firearm, teaching you how to assemble it, disassemble it, how to troubleshoot any kind of problems that may have and repair those problems.
How many cases have you worked at SLED during your career?
I would say several thousand.
And do you have any teaching responsibilities at SLED?
I have. Throughout the years, I have been a training officer teaching new examiners how to become a firearm and tool mark examiner. I have taught outside agencies how to do serial number restoration. I have presented at a court reporters conference. I've presented at high school and college level courses. I presented to the National District Attorneys Association, their conferences where they teach prosecutors how to become prosecutors. I presented at those kind of conferences. I've had a number of opportunities to present and teach.
And have you ever been qualified as an expert in the area of firearms and firearms identification?
Yes, sir, I have.
Approximately how many times?
I believe 54 times now.
And which courts has that taken place?
I believe 52 times in state court and 2 times in federal court.
Your Honor, this time the state would offer Mr. Thrower as an expert in the field of firearms and firearms identification.
Says the defense.
Well qualified.
He's so qualified.
Now, Agent Thrower, if you could tell the jury a little bit about how you go about matching shell casings or fired bullets to particular weapons.
Well, if we have a firearm, one of the first things after I document the firearm, I'm going to test fire it. The reason we test fire the firearm is so that I can obtain test specimens, fired cartridge cases or fired bullets that I know came from that gun because I fired them. I use my comparison microscope, which is essentially 2 microscopes that sit side by side. They're connected through an ocular bridge, so when I look through my eyepieces, I can see through both microscopes simultaneously, and I can place the images side by side. I place one test specimen on the left stage, one test specimen on the right stage. I start to look at the item I have on the left stage. I look at what sort of markings may be on the cartridge case or bullet. I look at individual scratches or striations or impressions. I look at within a single scratch, I'll look at how tall the ridge is. I'll look at the shape of the ridge. I look at the next scratch over. I look at the same sort of things. By looking at each individual ridge and its overall characteristics and the furrows between the ridges, I start to see how each line compares to each other within a specific grouping. As we take that grouping, and you start taking the series of scratches side by side, you start to see a pattern. Once I am comfortable with that pattern, I then look at the second cartridge case or bullet. I look for that same pattern on the second cartridge case or bullet and see if I can find agreement. Once I find that agreement, if it's a bullet per se, we have what they call land and groove impressions. If I'm happy with the agreement I see on two lands, I consider this to be my phase point, and I'll take a Sharpie and I'll mark it. Then I'll rotate the two bullets together. So I go from a land 1 to land 2, and I start comparing the markings on land 1 or land 2 versus land 2. And then I rotate it again, looking for similarities all the way around. Once I believe I found these similarities all the way around the outside of the projectile, I then take one of them and I rotate it out of phase. Now I want to see how much similarity I can find in what we call a known non-match. And I'll compare the areas that should not match just to see how much similarity I can find where it should not match. Once this is complete, I take one of my test specimens down and I mount an evidence specimen. And this process continues. I'll look to see, I'll line two lands up and see if this is an area where they match. If not, I'll rotate. Get land 1 versus land 2. Continue the process until where I find where I believe it matches, and then I rotate them together, once again looking for similarity all the way around the projectile.
And you indicate on fired bullets that there are marks, you call lands and grooves. Can you explain what that means?
In most firearms, pretty much just about anything except a shotgun, the inside the barrel, the bore of the barrel, is something called rifling. Rifling is a series of spiraling grooves that travel the length of the barrel. The purpose of these spiraling grooves is to cause the bullet to rotate or spin around its axis as it travels from the muzzle to the target. The reason they do this is that gyroscopic stability action gives the bullet stability in flight. It causes it to travel further and more accurately. The good thing for examiners is it also scratches the outside of the bullet. So it gives us something to work with. Much like a football player throwing a football, if it has that nice tight spiral, it goes where it's supposed to go. If it wobbles end over end, like when I throw a football, it goes somewhere else. But like I said, these spiraling grooves, the raised area between the groove is known as a land. The depressed area is known as a groove.
And on the shell casings themselves, what causes marks or things that you'd be looking for to identify what the mark is?
Typically, I am looking for impressions from the breech face. If you've ever seen a cartridge, the bullet is on this end and there's writing on this end. That writing is called the head stamp. And typically in centerfire ammunition, there's the primer or the ignition component is in the center. In firearms, there's a block of steel that sits behind that head stamped area, so that when you fire a gun, all the gas pressure that pushes that bullet down the barrel towards the target pushes equally hard rearward. Every action has an equal but opposite reaction. So it slams that cartridge case into that block of steel known as the breech face and can cause a stamping type motion. Those are called breech face marks. Also in the firearm there's something called a firing pin. The firing pin is what strikes the ignition component known as the primer and causes the cartridge to fire. It can leave a dent or an impression known as a firing pin impression. There's also numerous other marks known as an extractor mark, which is a hook that pulls the cartridge out of the chamber. The ejector, which as the extractor is pulling the cartridge out, the extractor sits still and causes the cartridge case to flip out of the gun. That's the ejector. There can be chamber marks. The inside of the barrel bore that actually holds the cartridge during firing, once again, when all those pressures are pushing that bullet down the barrel, cause that cartridge case to expand like a balloon within that confined area known as the chamber. As that extractor is trying to pull that cartridge case out, while that cartridge case is ballooning, it causes a lot of friction between the outside of the cartridge case and the inside of that chamber and scratches the outside of that cartridge case. Those are chamber marks. And essentially any other part of the firearm that comes into contact with that cartridge case can leave marks on it.
In regards to this case, did you have the opportunity to examine some evidence that had been submitted to Slager's Crime Lab?
Yes, sir, I did.
And I'm going to show you some exhibits now. States 48, I believe is already in evidence. Take a look at that briefly. There's a zip tie to the gun, so I believe it's safe, but I'm sure you can check it.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, as you can see, there are zip ties through the barrel and chamber, and I just checked this firearm both by sight and by feel. It is unloaded. It is safe for me to handle.
Also, the state's exhibits 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, and 32, which are also already in evidence.
Okay. I do recognize this firearm. It bears my case number, my item numbers, and my initials, where I engraved on it with a electric engraver. And that is, the gun is State's Exhibit 48.
Regarding State's Exhibit 25 through 32, if you can take a look at those and tell us if you recognize those items as well.
State's Exhibit 25 is SLED's item 11. Yes, it is a 45 caliber or 45 auto caliber cartridge case, fired cartridge case. State's Exhibit 26 is SLED item number 12. It is also a 45 caliber fired cartridge case. It also bears my case number, item number, and initials. State's Exhibit 27 is SLED item 13. It's another fired 45 auto caliber cartridge case. State's Exhibit 28 is SLED item number 14. Another 45 auto caliber fired cartridge case. State's Exhibit 29 is SLED item 15. Another 45 auto caliber fired cartridge case. State's Exhibit 30 is SLED item number 16. So another 45 auto caliber fired cartridge case. State's Exhibit 31 is SLED item number 17. One 45 auto caliber fired cartridge case. And State's Exhibit 32, SLED item number 18. One fired 45 auto caliber cartridge case. I do recognize these items. They will all bear my, or SLED lab number, item number, and my initials where I engraved on them.
And also going to show you State's Exhibits 39, 40, 41, and 42, which are not in evidence. We want for identification at this time.
State's Exhibit 39 is SLED item 19. It's one fired bullet. State's Exhibit 40 is SLED item 20. Is one fired bullet core. State's Exhibit 41 is SLED item 21, one fired bullet. And State's Exhibit 42 is sled item number 22. One fired bullet. Once again, I do recognize all these items. They also have been engraved with the sled lab number, the item number, and my initials.
And are each of those items, did each of those come into your possession on April the 6th of 2015?
Excuse me while I refer to the chain of custody. Yes, I received each of these items on April 6th of 2015.
Does that indicate who you received them from?
Received them from Al Brown of the Sled Crime Scene Unit.
And did you also receive additional evidence, specifically in Shady States Exhibits 52 and 53 on April 21st, 2015? These are also for identification. Actually, these are already in evidence.
State's Exhibit 52 is sled item 54, and State's Exhibit 53 is sled item 55. I cannot see my markings on these through several layers of plastic, but they are still in the container with my original heat seal.
And did you also receive those from Al Brown as well?
Yes, sir.
Lieutenant Thrower, regarding the State's Exhibit 48, the Glock pistol, could you tell the jury what you did with that item while it's in your possession?
Yes, sir. With the pistol, first thing I would have done would open the container. I would compare the description that we had in our evidence inventory system with what was actually written on the gun, verifying that I had what was being described. I would then look for any sort of trace evidence on it. After that, I would take pictures documenting how the firearm was received and any kind of markings that may be on the gun. Then I'd have a couple of worksheets, departmental worksheets that I fill out, documenting various things, make, model, caliber, serial number, type of notes about the firearm. I would cycle it and make sure the gun appears to not have to look for any sort of safety malfunctions. Then I would test fire the firearm into our bullet recovery tank, which is about a 3-foot diameter piece of pipe that goes down through the floor. It's 2 stories tall in the building. There's a large cone in the bottom of it, and it's full of water. So when I'm test firing, I shoot the gun down into the water. The water slows the projectile to a safe speed, and then the bullet bounces along the cone and winds up in a cup. I simply pull the chain that's attached to the cup, and I can dump my test specimens in my hand. This is how we recover test-fired bullets and cartridge cases from firearms for analysis. After test firing the gun, I would have proceeded with a normal examination of the bullet versus bullet, cartridge case versus cartridge case. And one of the very final things, as I'm wrapping up the case, I go back and I test fire trigger pull. I weigh the trigger pull to see how much pressure it takes on the trigger to cause the firearm to fire.
And were you able to determine that State's Exhibit 48, the Glock pistol, was in working order?
Correct. It was in working order.
If you can, on the Glock, if you take the Glock out of the box, what I'd like you to do is pointing it in a safe direction away from everyone. If you can stand up and show the jury, if you're aiming that way, which way the shell casings come out and which direction they go.
Generally speaking, normally, if you hold the gun in an upright position, they normally go out up and to the right. Sometimes, on occasion, they may go to the left, but normally speaking, if the gun is held upright, it's designed to eject them up and to the right. If you change the way you're holding it, now it will throw them to the left. Or if you're left-handed, now it's going to throw them at the ground. A lot depends on orientation of the firearm as it's being held.
But for a right-handed shooter in a classic shooting stance, the bullet within the upright position, the bullet would normally go out, back to the correct?
Normally, as designed, you would expect to find the cartridge cases ejected up and towards the right.
And in general, I know there are probably a lot of variables that tie into this. When those shell casings eject out of the gun, is there any standard or common or usual distance that they would go?
It can vary between different makes and models of guns. It also varies depending on the caliber of the cartridge, how much gunpowder is in there. So it can vary tremendously. It also can vary depending on what the surface is the cartridge cases are landing on. If it's hard and they can bounce or roll versus landing in grass, they tend to stop.
And it could also vary if the shell casing kicks back and lands on your shoulder.
Correct.
Okay. Now, regarding the shell casings themselves that you examined, State's Exhibits 25 through 32, I know generally you've described your normal process. Did you examine each of those shell casings physically?
Yes, sir. I examined each shell or cartridge case individually.
Sorry, I keep calling them shell
Yeah.
casings. It's what we used to call them. Were you able to determine the make and caliber of each of those cartridge cases?
I believe they were all yes, they were all Remington is the brand, and they were all .45 auto caliber.
And in general terms, a .45 caliber would be considered a large caliber weapon.
For a handgun, it's a large diameter bullet, yes.
And were each of those cartridge casings microscopically compared to test fire from the Glock pistol?
Yes, sir.
And what conclusion were you able to reach regarding State's Exhibits 25 through 32?
In forming those comparisons, the amount of similarity I noted between the markings on the fired cartridge cases and the markings on the test specimens were so significant that I believe State's Exhibits 25 through 32 were fired by State's Exhibit 48.
And now if we could talk about State's Exhibits 39, 41, or State's Exhibit 39, which is, I believe, labeled as a fired bullet from Walter Scott's abdominal area. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And State's Exhibit 41, which I believe is labeled from the pericardium of Walter Scott. Is that correct?
Correct.
And states 42, which is labeled as a bullet from the anterior right hip of Walter Scott.
Correct.
And states exhibit 52, which is, I believe, labeled as a fired bullet from a flag.
I'm sorry, which item?
States exhibit 52.
52. Correct, from flag.
And for those items specifically, were those also examined in the process which you described to the jury previously?
Yes, yes, they were.
And were those also microscopically compared to bullets fired from States Exhibit 48?
Yes, they were.
And were you able to reach a conclusion as to those projectiles, States Exhibits 39, 41, 42, and 52?
Yes, sir. Once again, the amount of agreement that I saw between my test specimens and these items were so significant that I believe that they were fired by the States Exhibit 48 pistol.
And regarding States Exhibits 40, which I believe is labeled as a fired bullet from the left anterior chest of Walter Scott.
Yes, sir.
And States Exhibit 53, which I believe is labeled as a bullet near the fence.
Yes, sir.
Were you able, did you go through the same, or were you able to reach any conclusion regarding whether those items were fired by States Exhibit 48 or not?
Yes, sir. Basically, my analysis, States Exhibit 40 was a bullet core. That means that the jacket is missing the outside part of the copper that actually touches the inside of the barrel. It's gone, so it did not have any markings on it from the firearm. So I concluded that States Exhibit 40 was unsuitable for identification. And States Exhibit 53, which was the bullet near the fence. Slide item 50. Yeah, slide item 55. Was also, it had the jacket, but it was so damaged and the markings that were on it were so poor that I could not identify it to a specific firearm. However, the class characteristics that were there were consistent with the gun. And class characteristics being it's the same caliber, same type of rifling, it's polygonal rifling, same number of lands and grooves, same direction of twist.
Your Honor, this time the state would ask to admit States Exhibits 39, 40, 41, and 42 into evidence.
Any objection?
No objection.
They are admitted without objection.
Yeah, States Exhibits 39 and 42, the fired bullet is on there.
40, 42, I think there's 39, 40, 41, 42.
This time, if we could, we'd like to publish these literature. Before I do that, regarding States Exhibits 39, 41, also 42, can you explain to the jury, so when they get them, how those end up in that condition, and what that's called normally?
As you will see, they're kind of opened up or expanded that is known as mushrooming. This is a hollow point bullet, so when it starts off, there's a cavity in the nose of the bullet. As it strikes its target, that cavity opens up and expands so that it becomes larger in diameter. Basically, it's trying to stop within the target and deliver all of its energy to the target. So it does this mushrooming, and it just opens up.
And is it a common law enforcement round would be a hollow point?
Correct. Yes, sir.
When you say mushrooms inside, that's to essentially increase the stopping power.
Correct.
And on State's Exhibit 40, can you just kind of explain the condition of the back, what that is in relation in comparison to those things?
State's Exhibit 40, once again, is a fired bullet core. It is consistent with being from a hollow point bullet, so once again, on one end, you'll see where that cavity started to open. You can see that in how the lead is starting to peel back, but the brass-colored jacket on this bullet is missing. It came apart and is missing.
And those exhibits are the ones that were recovered from the victim at autopsy. Could you describe for the jury the difference why those items look the way they do and why State's Exhibits 52 and 53, which were recovered from the fence and the flag, would have different characteristics?
The State's exhibits that you have, I believe, were all recovered from autopsy or from a victim. As they strike flesh, they tend to open up, assuming there's no intermediary target. If there is an intermediary target, or if they strike something else, especially at an angle, sometimes they don't open up. So as you see these two, these are consistent with having struck something else, and being that they were found near a fence and near a flag, they were heavily scratched and abraded, which is consistent with having hit dirt or some other rough object, and that will explain kind of why these look differently. It just depends on what they hit and how they performed.
I don't have any more questions, Your Honor. Just waiting for the exhibit to make its way back.
All exhibits will be in the jury room at the end of the case. You can publish them, but we're going to proceed with the case.
I have no more questions.
All right. Cross-examination.
Morning.
Good morning, sir.
Do you estimate how many hours that all these tests that you talked to the jury about this morning, and how much time was invested in those examinations?
In this case alone?
Yes, sir.
In this case, it appears I have about 5 days.
Would that be 5
I did not document what time I started or finished. I just documented how many days, or which days I was working on it.
And as a result of those 5 days, you have been able to tell the jury that the weapon that fired the bullets that wound up killing Mr. Scott were fired by Officer Slager.
What I can tell the jury is that the bullets and cartridge cases that I have talked about were fired by that firearm. I have no knowledge of who fired them.
And in those 5 days that you tested those items, did you test how far it would discharge to the right when the instrument is fired?
No, sir. In our bullet recovery area, we simply put a lid down on the tank with the hole that we shoot through, and there's a paper bag that sits next to it, and when we fire, it throws the cartridge cases into that paper bag.
If it was important to know, based on the crime scene, the distance or the attitude of the discharge cartridge, what direction it went in, you could test that, could you not?
It is possible. However, there are many things that we do not know about the crime scene and how things went down. Once again, how was the gun being held? Was it being held slightly canted or any sort of angle? How tall was the person? You know, we could have gotten that information and figured out how high we need to hold the gun above the ground. Left-handed versus right-handed. There's many variables that can go into how this gun ejects cartridge cases. Then we get into what is the surface. We would have to make sure we had the same type of surface. Is it sand or is it tall grass where the cartridge case comes to an end? It stops where it lands, as opposed to is it on concrete or some hard surface where it could roll or be kicked by a boot from an investigator walking through a crime scene so it moves. Is there any movement to the crime scene during the shooting? Is the person standing perfectly still, or is there any movement? As soon as you start having any movement, measurements start to become very vague and meaningless. So generally speaking, that's not an exam we perform very often.
Have you seen the photographs taken by Mr. Brown and his colleagues?
I don't believe so, no, sir.
Do you know whether the photographs taken by Mr. Brown would give you an indication of what the surface was?
I could probably look at those and figure that out, yes, sir.
And did you know there was a video of the shooting?
Yes, sir.
And did you look at the video to see those variables that you just described?
We could probably look at the video, but I did not, no, sir.
Now, the type of weapon that you have in front of you, that's a issued police department weapon?
I would assume so. I have no personal knowledge.
But there's nothing nefarious about that type of weapon?
No, sir. It's a Glock, which is one of the most popular brands of police-issued firearms.
Anybody in this courtroom without a compromising issue, Sal, say could purchase one of those?
Yes, sir.
How many bullets does that cartridge, that weapon, hold?
The magazine during testing would hold 13, and then you could place one more in the chamber for a total of 14 rounds.
And do you know how many bullets were still in that weapon when it was recovered by Mr. Brown or his colleagues?
There were 5 in the magazine, and then 1 additional that was submitted.
And would you conclude from that the shooting was a controlled shooting?
I have no way of determining that from how many rounds were submitted with it.
The firing stopped with 6 bullets remaining in the weapon. Correct?
That's what was submitted to me, yes, sir.
And based on your training, your knowledge, and experience, when a police officer utilizes lethal force,
That is what I was trained, yes, sir.
Don't answer any more questions about
You can redirect.
Thank you. Regarding that last question, Mr. Savage asked you, that you referred to your training experience, that's what you were trained to do. The primary predicate or basis of that is that it's actually a threat, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Now, regarding the, he asked you about the distance of the ejection of the cartridge casings.
Yes, sir.
And you went through some facts. I believe you included the height of the person that was shooting, how they were holding the gun, and some other issues that could affect the distance that the shell casing would go when it comes out of the gun. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
So if you have that same weapon, and you get a standard box of 50 rounds of ammunition, or 20 or whatever came in, if you fired every one of those from the same position, each cartridge casing wouldn't go exactly a pile right next to you at the same distance every time.
No, sir. They tend to scatter some. Some weapons or some firearms scatter them more than others. Something else to keep in mind is I would be limited based on how much ammunition was submitted. Submitted ammunition is important in doing this type of examination because of how that ammunition has been stored. Ammunition with the gun has probably been stored the same way. It can be affected by heat, humidity, how the gun has been oiled, and that sort of thing. All these things can affect, the primer can affect the gunpowder inside and how it discharges. If I was to use ammunition that we went to the store and bought or ammunition that was in our reference collection, it may actually cause that pattern to vary slightly.
And even if you have the same type of ammunition, all held in the same condition, factors such as how tight you grip the weapon or whether you jerk when you shoot would affect that as well.
Yes, sir. There's
Anyone's ever shot a firearm or Glock specifically, on occasion those will come back and get down your shirt and burn the neck and your back. Is that correct?
absolutely, yes,
So
sir.
even with all the same rounds from the same box of ammo kept in the same position, they don't land exactly in the same spot.
Exactly. And like I said before, I've shot guns where it was ejecting to the right, and then for some reason, just one round, it threw it to the left. I don't know why.
Thank you. No further questions.
Anything further? Thank you. You may step down. Call your next witness.
State Outstanding Stewart.
You swear affirm the testimony you shall give the court and jury in the trial of this case to be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? I do. Please state your first and last name, spell your last name loudly, clearly, and politely.
Samuel Stewart, S-T-E-W-A-R-T.
How you doing today?
Good morning.
Could you tell the jury where you work?
I work for the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, commonly known as SLED.
And what do you do in SLED?
I am a forensic scientist assigned to the DNA casework department. We're also known as DNA analysts.
How long have you been with SLED?
4.5 years.
And for that 4.5 years, have you been in the DNA lab the entire time?
That is correct.
And could you tell the jury a little bit about your educational background?
I received my bachelor's in science and biology from Francis Marion University. I also received in-house SLED training under other court-qualified analysts for over 1.5 years, where I had to successfully complete a written exam, an oral exam, a competency, and a mock trial before I was deemed competent as a DNA analyst.
And that's the in-house DNA analyst training?
That is correct.
And outside of that in-house training, have you attended any seminars or courses or any other training related to the field of DNA analysis?
Yes, I have. We're also required to have 8 hours of continuing education every year.
And are you certified as a result of all that by SLED to perform DNA analysis?
Yes, I have.
And you said you've been in the DNA lab for 4.5 years. How long have you been actually handling cases of your own?
3.
And in that time, how many cases have you handled?
Hundreds.
And in addition to the training you've already gone through, did you also say you had some continuing education requirements?
Yes, we have 8 hours of continuing education every year.
And have you previously been qualified as an expert in the area of DNA analysis?
Yes, I have.
And how many times has that taken place?
20.
And are those, which courtrooms or what courts have you had that?
General sessions within South Carolina.
Your Honor, this time we would offer Mr. Stewart as an expert in the area of forensic DNA analysis.
Says the defense. He's admitted without objection.
Thank you. This means and entails?
Yes. First, DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. It is the genetic material that's found in every individual and is responsible for certain traits such as our eye and our hair color. DNA is composed of dense packets known as chromosomes, which are found in every cell in the human body, excluding red blood cells. We receive half of our chromosomes from our mother and the other half from our father. On those chromosomes, we target certain locations. Those locations are known as STRs. We look at 16 different of those STR locations that are found on your chromosomes to develop what is known as a DNA profile.
That be the only instance where two people would have the same DNA profile, exact same DNA profile.
That is correct.
And could you, in as general terms as you can make DNA, explain to the jury how you go about developing a DNA profile?
First, we have to extract it from an item. Usually, we get it as a cutting or maybe a cotton swab, a sterile cotton swab. Then we will extract that DNA from that item. Once we have extracted it, then we want to find out exactly how much DNA we have. So we use a process known as quantifying the DNA to get exactly how much DNA we have. This is important because for us to actually develop the DNA profile, we have to have it within a certain range or concentration. So once we are able to identify the amount of DNA that we have, we can either dilute it if it exceeds that range, or we can concentrate it that way to try to build up as much DNA as there as possible. Once we have the right range, I should say a right amount, we can run it on one of our instruments. It separates the DNA to those 16 different STR locations, as I stated, and that is the profile that we use to identify or make comparisons upon.
So when you were talking about quantifying DNA, it has to be within a certain range?
That is correct.
So you can have not only too little DNA to make a profile, but you may actually have too much DNA.
That is correct.
And did you have the opportunity to examine evidence for DNA related to your lab number L1504608?
Yes, I did.
And do you recall where you or who you obtained that evidence from?
The first submission of evidence that I received was from Mr. Almond Brown, and that was on April the 6th, 2015.
And I'll just show you states exhibits. 37. States 38. States 43. And states 44 and 45, which are marked by identification.
Okay. States Exhibit 44 and 45, sled item 29 and 30. These were fingernail scrapings from Walter Scott, right fingernail scrapings and left hand fingernail scrapings. States Exhibit 43, sled item 28. This item is a blood spot card from Walter Scott. States Exhibit 36 and 37, items 23 and 24. These are swabs from, item 23 is the swabs from the red stain from officer's shirt. I apologize. Swabs of red stain from officer's shirt, and item 24 is swabs of red stain from officer's pants. States Exhibit 38, I have not seen this item before.
Swabs from a taser.
Can't hear you.
So I believe States Exhibit 38 is described as 2 swabs from a taser. Did you have the opportunity to examine those items?
Yes, I did. Item 27 is the swab from the taser.
So you do recognize States Exhibit 38?
Yes, I do.
Okay. And those items were the items you received from Mr. Brown on April 6th?
That is correct.
And were they properly sealed and labeled when they were given to you?
Yes, they were.
Were there any indications that any of the items had been tampered with in any way?
No, there was not.
And moving up to April the 9th, I'll show you States Exhibit 64. States Exhibit 64, which has just been marked for identification at this time. I believe it's your sled in lab number 52, swab from Mr. Slager.
Yes, that is correct.
And do you recall who you, or do your paperwork indicate who you received those items from?
Yes, on April the 9th, 2015, I received item 52 from Ms. Doris Yarbrough.
Sled item 52, which is a number you put on it at the lab, corresponds to State's Exhibit 64 for the record. And when you received that item, was it properly packaged and sealed?
Yes, it was.
And was there any evidence that it had been tampered with in any way?
No, there was not.
And it's labeled as a buccal swab. Can you explain for the jury what a buccal swab is?
Yes, a buccal swab is a sterile swab similar to a cotton swab that you would find in your house that we use to collect cheek cells from an individual. Basically, it's the skin cells from somebody. And we use that as a known standard for that individual to develop a DNA profile to use for comparison.
And you say you use those on the cheek of a person. Can you just kind of show the jury
Yes,
how you do that?
the individual opened their mouth, and we would just take a swab, if I had one, and we would just swipe the inside of the mouth gently, just to collect the cells.
And was State's Exhibit 64 the DNA sample or the standard that you used for the defendant in this case, Michael Slager?
Yes, it is.
And what was used to obtain the DNA standard for Mr. Scott, Walter Scott?
We used a blood spot card.
And that's State's Exhibit 43, which I believe is in front of you still?
Yes, it is.
And let's move on to the results of your analysis, any analysis, DNA analysis that you conducted in this case. Starting with State's Exhibit 36, which I believe is two swabs. You described it as two swabs of red stain from the officer's shirt. Is that correct?
I'm sorry. Just one second. Yes, that's correct. Our item 23.
Okay. And if you could tell the jury what your findings were regarding your analysis of that item.
Item 23, which again is the swabs of red stain from officer's shirt. The results are the DNA profile developed from item 23 is a mixture of at least two individuals. The DNA profile of the major contributor to this mixture matches the DNA profile of Michael Slager. The probability of randomly selecting an unrelated individual having a DNA profile matching the major contributor to this mixture is 1 in 84 quadrillion. The DNA profile of the minor contributor to this mixture is insufficient for interpretation.
Let's start with where you said it's a mixture of two individuals, at least two individuals. Could it be? Is it possible that could be more than two?
It is possible.
And you also said that Mr. Slager described as a major contributor. Is that correct?
That is correct. Occasionally when we're doing a testing on item, we have more than one individual contributing their item, their DNA to that item. When we have that happen, we label it as a mixture. And also occasionally when we have one individual contributing more DNA to that item than the other person. We'll separate those individuals if we can, if they meet the criteria, as a major contributor and a minor contributor. In this case, I was able to identify a major contributor in that mixture for item 23, and that major contributor matches the DNA profile of Michael Slager.
And you said occasionally you're able to determine a major contributor. It seems to me that would that indicate that you can't always make that?
That is correct. We can't always determine a major or a minor.
Okay. And can you tell the jury what 1 in 84 quadrillion means? How many zeros is that?
It's approximately 16 zeros. And what that means is if we took a random person's DNA profile and I compared it to the DNA profile of the major contributor to that mixture, there will be a 1 in 84 quadrillion chance that that random person's DNA profile would match the DNA profile of that major contributor to the mixture.
Do you know if there are that many people on Earth?
No, approximately it's, the population of the world is 7 billion.
And you indicated that the profile of the minor contributor was insufficient for interpretation. Can you tell the jury what that means?
That just means there wasn't enough genetic material there for me to be able to make any kind of comparisons to that minor contributor. And in your reports, I believe initially your April 13th, 2015 report, you had indicated it was 1 in 87 quadrillion, and then in a supplemental July 13th report,
that was changed to 1 in 84 quadrillion. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Can you explain to the jury what, if any, or what caused this change?
Yes, there was an update to the FBI database that we use to generate statistics from. This update didn't change the effects of a match or inclusion to a mixture. It just changed the stats slightly. So when we were identified of the update, we went back and made sure that we updated all statistics that were reported for those using the old database, and we used a new database to regenerate that statistic.
So it's a statistical change as opposed to any change in the analysis or the profile of the results?
That is correct.
And if we can move on to State's Exhibit 37, which I believe is SLED item number 24, swabs of red stain from Officer Slager's pants.
Yes, the DNA profile developed from item 24 matches the DNA profile of Michael Slager. The probability of randomly selecting an unrelated individual having a DNA profile matching this item is approximately 1 in 84 quadrillion.
And so that was just Officer Slager's DNA located, not a mixture of anyone else.
That is correct.
And now regarding State's Exhibit 38, which is SLED item number 27, 2 swabs from the taser. Do you have the opportunity to perform analysis on those items?
Yes, I did.
And could you tell the jury what your findings were?
The DNA profile developed from item 27 is a mixture of at least 2 individuals. Walter Scott and Michael Slager cannot be excluded as possible contributors to this mixture. The probability of randomly selecting an unrelated individual who could have contributed to this mixture is approximately 1 in 130,000.
And again, it was, in this case, you described it as a mixture of at least 2 individuals. Does that indicate that it could have been more than 2?
That is correct.
And when you say that Walter Scott and Michael Slager cannot be excluded as possible contributors to the mixture, what does that mean?
That means that when I compare both of their DNA profiles to that mixture, I was unable to exclude them as possible contributors to that mixture.
And are you, based off what you found, were you able to identify if either Mr. Scott or Mr. Slager were what you would call major contributors?
No. When I analyzed or when I looked at the results, it was to me determined that both individuals may have contributed equally to the taser.
So because they may have contributed equally, you're not able to determine a major or a minor?
That is correct.
And how many swabs were contained in State's Exhibit 38?
2.
And were those swabs, which I assume are how many, were they tested separately?
No, they were not.
And why not?
Both items were in the container. So to me, using our SLED policy, both swabs were taken from the same area to my understanding. So I combined both of them to ensure that I would get a strong DNA profile from it.
And is that what you meant earlier by getting within a range?
Yes, that is correct.
And on your report, your chart that's attached to it, you indicated that there appears to be DNA at 3 locations, which does not belong to Scott or Slager. Is that correct?
Yes, there are some locations that do have some numbers or DNA types that do not belong to Walter Scott or Michael Slager.
And what kind of conclusion, if any, can you draw from that?
There is maybe a possible minor third contributor there, but I couldn't be sure.
And when you're performing these analyses, are you able to determine the source of the DNA? Like the original source, for example, whether it's from blood or whether it's from sweat, whether it's from skin cells?
Yes, we do have the ability, if it's requested, to do bodily fluid testing, which is known as serology, on certain items.
And in the process of your DNA analysis, are you able to determine whether a DNA profile obtained from an object such as a taser that was swabbed if that DNA was deposited on the taser by someone primarily handling it, or if DNA can be transferred to it secondarily?
That is possible, but I do not have any knowledge of how the DNA got there.
And can you tell the jury what a secondary transfer is?
Yes, secondary transfer is the process in which the individual may touch an item, and that person may have left their DNA on that item. Then a second individual may come behind them, touch that same item, and then they may touch another item. So if I may explain, let's say a doorknob. An individual touches a doorknob, and they potentially left their DNA on that doorknob. Then a second individual comes behind them, touches that same doorknob. Now, potentially, that second individual has that first individual's DNA on their hand, and then they may go touch an elevator button. So it's potentially possible that that second individual has now transferred that first individual's DNA to the elevator button. That is what we would know as secondary transfer.
So under that theory, if someone's DNA is on an object, it doesn't necessarily mean that they actually handled that object.
That is possible.
Using the taser, for example, if someone's DNA is on the taser, it doesn't automatically mean that they had actually themselves touched the taser. It's possible that if someone touched them and then touched the taser, that their DNA could be there.
Yes, that is possible.
And are there any, what effect, if any, does sweating or temperature or anything else have on the possibility of transferring DNA?
There's no really kind of research on that, but I believe it is possible for sweat to transfer DNA, because your DNA would be found, your skin cells would be in your sweat, so it is possible for that to happen.
So if someone was sweating and someone touched their arms or their wrists and then touched an object, such as a taser or the DNA, is it possible it could be transferred?
Yes, I believe that is possible.
And I don't know if they issue these to you in the lab, but are you familiar with a taser?
No, I am not.
Have you ever heard of the phrase drive stunning?
Not until recently.
And if someone was to drive stun, which is touch a taser to a person, is it possible that the person being drive stunned, their DNA could transfer to that taser?
Yes, I believe so.
And by that, in that same scenario, if someone being drive stunned pushes away or hits the taser, is it possible their DNA could be placed on the taser that way as well?
Yes, it is possible.
Now, regarding State's Exhibit 44, which is your sled item 29, the right fingernail clippings of Mr. Scott from autopsy, did you have the opportunity to analyze those?
Yes. Item 29, the DNA profile developed from item 29 is a mixture of at least two individuals. The DNA profile of the major contributor to this mixture is attributable to Walter Scott. The partial DNA profile of the minor contributor to this mixture is from an unidentified individual. Michael Slager is excluded as a possible minor contributor.
So your finding is the fingernail clippings of Mr. Scott, he's the major contributor,
That is correct.
and Mr. Slager is excluded as contributing to that mixture.
That is correct.
Now, regarding State's Exhibit 45, which is sled item 30, the left fingernail clippings of Mr. Scott from autopsy, what were your findings regarding those items?
The DNA profile developed from item 30 is a mixture of at least two individuals. DNA types attributable to Walter Scott are present within this mixture. Michael Slager is excluded as a possible contributor.
So in both instances of fingernail clippings, left and right, there's no DNA, or Mr. Slager is excluded as a contributor to that.
That is correct.
And on States 44 and 45, your sled 29 and 30 we just talked about, is there a minor contributor that's not Mr. Slager? It's a mixture, so there's another contributor.
Yes, item 29. Yes, there is.
And is the profile that you developed on that consistent with it being the same person?
Yes, it is for item 29.
Did you also have the opportunity to examine swabs from a taser cartridge, from two sets of swabs from taser cartridges, as well as swabs from a probe and swabs from an entire probe as well?
Yes, I did.
And were you able to develop any DNA profiles or get any DNA findings related to those items?
Item 26, which was swabs from a taser cartridge, the partial DNA profile developed from that item was insufficient for interpretation. Item 25 was another set of swabs from the taser cartridge, and no DNA profile was developed from that item. Swabs from an entire probe, that was OSLED items 6.1 and 8.1, and no DNA profile was developed from those items.
Your Honor, this time the state would offer states exhibits 36, 37, 38, 43, 44, 45, and 64 in the evidence.
Without objection.
They're admitted without objection.
Thank you. Please answer the questions, Mr. McHugh.
Mr. McHugh?
Thank you, Mayor. Please report.
Yes, sir.
Good morning, Mr. Stewart.
Good morning.
You are a DNA analyst at this time, correct?
Yes, I am.
So you don't actually collect the DNA yourself. You analyze the DNA that's been presented to you from other sources.
That is correct.
Have you ever had training in DNA collection?
Yes, I have.
And how did you receive that training?
Within SLED.
And as a collector of DNA, you know that DNA can reside in several different areas, correct? Body fluids, for example.
Yes, that is correct.
So blood, saliva, semen, areas like that.
That is correct.
It can also reside in skin cells.
Yes, that is correct.
And the amount of DNA that resides in a particular area depends on a whole lot of variables, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And so when one is collecting DNA from a crime scene, one needs to think about how the DNA might best be collected to both preserve DNA and to make sure that the DNA is meaningful, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Now, in this case, you received items from the investigation and then you analyzed them, is that correct?
That is correct.
Did you direct anyone in the crime scene department to perform any particular test or collection method before you got the material?
No, I did not.
Were you ever consulted by anyone from the crime scene division before you got the material?
No, I was not.
When you analyze the DNA, it comes to you, you said, in different forms. It can come as a swab.
That is correct.
Or a swatch of clothing.
Yes, that is correct.
Or a blood spot.
Yes.
Or a buccal swab.
Yes, that's correct.
Can you tell the jury what touch DNA is?
Yes, touch DNA is essentially DNA that may be left on an item that an individual may have handled or touched.
And how does touch DNA get there? What causes touch DNA to be there?
You flaking off skin cells.
And when you flake off skin cells, the skin cells remain on the surface, correct?
Yes, potentially.
And then what is the preferred method for collecting touch DNA, or is there one?
Yes, the way we prefer it is that we take 2 sterile swabs. You moisten one swab with sterile water, and you try to, collect with the area that you're swabbing with that first moistened swab, followed by a dry sterile swab. And we use both of those items to potentially collect any DNA that may be there.
Okay, so just to be clear on this, you have a moistened swab first,
That is correct.
and you swab the area that you would like to have the DNA from, and then it's followed by a dry swab.
That is correct.
So if one were to collect DNA by using both a moistened swab and a dry swab in tandem at the same time, that would be not what you're used to receiving for the collection. Is that true?
Yes, that is correct. Usually one and then followed by the other. But I think it can be done both, but yeah, preferred first the moistened followed by the dry.
When you receive the material in the lab from SLED, it's stored in a safe place where it's untampered with, correct?
That is correct.
So you received some material from this case, and what date did you receive it?
The first set of evidence I received was on April the 6th, 2015.
Okay. Now, do you have any familiarity with fingerprint analysis?
No, I do not.
Do you know if it's possible to both do a fingerprint analysis and collect DNA samples on the same surface?
I know it's not preferred. We usually would like either one or the other. It is possible in some instances, but from my knowledge, I know that some things that they use to collect fingernail print can inhibit or maybe degrade some of the DNA that may be potentially there. But preferably, we would like one or the other, but I know it is possible to do both.
So it is possible to do both, but it'd be very important to do it in the correct order, right?
That is correct.
So the the fingerprint analysis would come first,
Yes.
and that is because spoke with you in September, and we discussed a few items. One is the particular type of collection of evidence off, say, a taser from which evidence was collected. Now, if I can find it. Here we go. Okay, I'm showing you what's been marked as State's Exhibit 49. It has the battery removed and the safety clip off, so it is inert and won't cause you any harm.
Okay.
Have you ever seen this item before?
No, I have not.
Could you tell the jury what you knew about the reason for collecting this DNA when it was collected? Were you given any reason for collecting the DNA from this item?
Not really. I think it was because it was used. It was my assumption, but no one gave me any kind of indication of why it was swabbed.
Did you have any idea, or did you know that there had been alleged there was a struggle for this weapon?
No, not at the time.
Okay, knowing that there had been a struggle for the weapon, would it have been possible to collect DNA from separate areas of this weapon instead of from the entire weapon?
Yes, that is possible.
Have you ever seen that done in the case of a firearm or a similar weapon being used?
Yes, with handguns, either our latent prints or our evidence collection, evidence processing or firearms, they will collect different parts or swab different parts of a handgun, maybe the trigger, maybe the barrel, maybe the handle, and submit those for DNA testing.
Okay, and could you just please point out to the jury on a weapon like this where one might assume you would do that sort of collection?
Okay, so if I'm treating this like a handgun, we may get swabs from this handle area. Then we will also get swabs from this trigger area, and then we may also get swabs from this area right here, this, I guess the barrel, I'm not sure.
Okay, thank you. And the reason you would collect evidence in a manner like that is to see if there was DNA perhaps localized to one of these particular areas. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And on this weapon, do you see any place that might be conducive? I know you're not a fingerprint expert, but do you see any place on here that might be conducive to retain a fingerprint, given your experience and training in forensic science?
Like I said, I don't have much experience handling weapons, but my assumption would be the handle right here, and if there was a struggle, maybe perhaps this barrel area and perhaps maybe the trigger. But that would be just my assumption. I have no training on that.
Thank you. And we talked a little bit about drive stunning with the taser.
Yes.
And the drive stun, you're not familiar with that at all?
Until just recently.
Okay. The drive stun area, once again, if there's a struggle or if there's something going on, alleged that this weapon was used, it would probably be important to swab the area where the drive stunning could have taken place in order to have a DNA sample from that as well. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. It would have been possible.
Thank you. Now, you received several items from Mr. Brown, I believe you said on the 6th of April?
That is correct.
And you said you got swabs of red stain from shirt and pants. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Just to make it easier on everyone, I'd like to, can I have this marked, please?
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll have you go to the jury, so please do not discuss the case. We'll take a few minutes. When you step down, please do not discuss your testimony during the break.